They called her a stray, an orphan with no family name, fit only to clear the stables of the royal pack. But when the time finally came for her to stand before the absolute authority of the realm, she would not beg. They thought her silence was submission, a hollow surrender to the crushing weight of the pack hierarchy. They did not know she was simply waiting. The bitter winter had long ago taught her that survival required a quiet, unyielding spine. The gelid air inside the royal pack stables was absolute. It crept through the rotting floorboards, curled around the heavy, furred ankles of the draft horses, and sank its teeth into the marrow of the lone girl, shoveling their filth. The massive beasts, bred for hauling timber from the deep woods, shifted uneasily in their stalls. Their hooves struck the heavy wooden planks with dull, rhythmic thuds, a slow percussion that underscored her solitary labor. Seraphina Vane pushed the heavy wooden pitchfork into the sub-zero mud. The splintered handle tore at the blistered skin of her palms, the raw flesh stinging with every thrust. She did not stop. She did not slow down. The rhythm of her labor was the only thing keeping the blood moving through her veins, forcing a frantic warmth into her extremities before the biting chill could permanently settle. Her exhales plumed in the freezing air, sharp and white against the dim, lantern-lit gloom. The heavy scent of animal musk, wet hay, and ammonia hung thick in the rafters, an oppressive perfume that clung to her threadbare woolen tunic. She was entirely alone in the cavernous wooden structure. The high-born wolves were safely tucked inside the stone walls of the keep, curled by roaring hearths and draped in velvet. Beyond those fortified stone walls, in the suffocating dark, there were only the beasts and the nameless Omega. Every outgoing gasp created a tiny, dissipating cloud of mist that momentarily obscured the rough-hewn beams above her head. A sharp crunch of boots on the frost-covered gravel shattered the quiet rhythm of her work. Seraphina did not immediately look up. She felt the shift in the air, the sudden intrusion of a sour, unfamiliar scent mixed with cheap lavender soap. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in a violent gust of the northern wind that instantly bit through her thin clothes. The raw wind felt like a blade scraping against her bruised collarbone. A senior maid stood in the doorway. The woman had recently been promoted to the inner kitchens, and she now wore a thick insulated wool cloak lined with rabbit fur. She carried a heavy wooden bucket in her hands, the rim slick with soapy grey washwater. Behind her, hovering nervously in the biting wind, was Gemma Sterling. The neighbour girl was still just another low-status maid, someone who had shared a quiet piece of bread with Seraphina by the hearth on a particularly harsh night. Gemma's eyes were wide with helpless apology, her thin shoulders trembling under a frayed shawl. But status in the Valdron pack was a disease that infected everything it touched, and the senior maid demanded an audience. The senior maid stepped into the stable, her nose wrinkling in exaggerated disgust. She looked at the kneeling figure in the mud, as if viewing a diseased animal. The petty cruelty of the low status trying to feel superior radiated from her posture. She wanted a reaction. She wanted the outcast to grovel, to acknowledge the sudden vast chasm in their ranks. In the rigid hierarchy of the Valdron pack, every ounce of power was hoarded, and the kitchen staff were notorious for exercising their meagre authority over those even lower on the chain. Seraphina represented the absolute bottom, a wolfless stray with no pack markings, no protective family, and a broken mate bond that marked her as fundamentally flawed. "Look at you," the senior maid sneered, her voice echoing off the damp wooden walls. "Still scrubbing the filth. I suppose it's exactly where a nameless stray belongs. You don't even have a pack name to put on a gravestone." Seraphina kept her gaze fixed on the frozen mud. Her silver eyes were terrifyingly calm, devoid of the tears or the pathetic whimpers the woman was so desperately seeking. She drove the pitchfork into the dirt again, the scrape of metal against stone ringing loudly in the silence. Her inner wolf, an ancient and sleeping thing, remained perfectly still. She knew what she was, unclaimed by them, yet destined for greatness. Her lineage was not measured by the petty ranks of a domestic kitchen, but she could not speak that truth. Not yet. The utter lack of response infuriated the newly promoted maid. A flush of angry color rushed to her cheeks. Her knuckles went white around the handle of the bucket. Without warning, she swung her arms forward, hurling the heavy contents of the bucket directly at the kneeling girl. The freezing, dirty washwater hit Serafina with the force of a physical blow. It soaked instantly through her threadbare tunic, plastering the thin wool to her shivering spine. The icy shock was visceral. Her skin shrank tightly against her ribs, her lungs seizing as the freezing temperature hijacked her nervous system. Dark, wet strands of hair plastered against her pale cheeks. The water dripped from her eyelashes, muddy and freezing in the frigid air. She stopped moving. Her fingers tightened around the wooden handle of the pitchfork. The physical agony of the freezing water biting into her raw skin was immense, but she forced her jaw to lock. She did not gasp. She did not cry. She simply slowly raised her head, turning those haunting storm-silver eyes toward her tormentor. The silence that followed was heavier than the winter wind. The senior maid took a sudden, involuntary step back. She had expected the stray to weep, to curl into a pathetic ball in the mud, to beg for a dry towel or a moment of mercy. Instead, the girl simply looked at her. There was no anger in that gaze, only a vast, freezing emptiness that made the hairs on the back of the maid's neck stand up. It was the look of something ancient, something that remembered how to wait. Swallowing hard, the instigator dropped the empty wooden bucket into the mud. The clatter was loud, clumsy, and entirely devoid of the authority she had tried to project. She gathered her thick, rabbit fur cloak around her neck and hurried from the stable, her boots stumbling slightly on the frost. She did not look back. Gemma Sterling lingered for a fraction of a second, her hands clenching in her apron as a small, choked sob escaped her throat. The neighbor girl reached into her pocket, hastily tossing a small, wrapped bundle of dry cloth and a piece of stale bread into the dry hay near Serafina's boots, before she too was forced to flee back to the kitchens. The wooden door slammed shut, sealing the Omega back into her isolated prisons of ice. Left alone in the freezing dark, Serafina did not immediately move. The icy water was already beginning to crystallize on the hem of her skirt. The stinging cold sank deep into her joints, threatening to lock her muscles entirely. Slowly, with agonizing precision, she lifted a numb hand and wiped the dirty water from her eyes. She picked up the pitchfork. She went back to work. She would survive this night, just as she had survived all the others. Every thrust of the iron prongs into the dirt was a deliberate rejection of their cruelty, a silent testament to her enduring fortitude. The physical labor provided a brutal, necessary heat. For another 2 hours, Serafina forced her battered body to clear the stalls, ignoring the burning ache in her shoulders and the sharp sting of the crystallizing ice against her thighs. Finally, when the last stall was lined with fresh, dry hay, she retrieved the small bundle Gemma Sterling had left behind. The stale bread was hard as stone, but it was sustenance. She ate it mechanically, letting the dry crumbs scratch her raw throat, before wrapping the thin, dry cloth tightly around her neck to block the biting draft. The small scrap of fabric offered meager warmth, but she accepted it with silent gratitude. Hours later, the deep blue of twilight had completely surrendered to a pitch-black, starless night. Pushing past the heavy oak doors of the lower courtyard, Serafina forced her stiffening legs to keep moving, dragging her battered boots across the endless, freezing expanse that separated the inner keep from the tree line. The biting wind relentlessly whipped against her damp clothing, threatening to freeze her solid with every grueling step. By the time she finally reached the eastern border of the king's territory, she was utterly exhausted. It was a desolate stretch of ancient pine trees and deep, unbroken snowdrifts. Serafina trudged through the knee-deep snow, her soaked clothes now stiff as frozen armor against her bruised skin. She was hauling a heavy sack of feed toward the outer perimeter, her boots crunching rhythmically in the absolute silence of the woods. The temperature had dropped to a lethal low. Her lips were cracked, tasting faintly of copper and salt. Every drawn gasp felt like inhaling crushed glass. The heavy sack cut viciously into her shoulder blade, threatening to pull her down into the endless white drifts. but the physical pain was nothing compared to the sudden, agonizing flare of the severed mate bond that abruptly bloomed in her chest. It was a dull, burning ache, a phantom limb being twisted in a vice. She stopped walking. The heavy sack of feed slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the snow with a soft thud. Before she even saw the shadows moving between the trees, her biology recognized the threat. The scent of pine, expensive leather, and suffocating arrogance flooded the freezing air. An explosion of snow erupted to her left as a massive black wolf broke through the tree line, its jaws snapping inches from her coat. It did not bite, merely herded her backward. 2 more heavily armed pack guards stepped from the shadows of the ancient pines, their hands resting on the hilts of their silver daggers. And then he walked into the clearing. Torrin Blackwood wore his authority like a weapon. His broad shoulders were draped in a heavy cloak of dark wolf fur, a visual reminder of his high status within the Royal Guard. His jaw was set in a hard, cruel line, but there was a desperate insecurity in his eyes, the look of a man who constantly needed to break others to feel tall. He was her former husband, the man who had severed their sacred bond to climb the pack hierarchy, leaving her hollow and discarded. He had presented her to the elders as a defective mate, someone who hindered his potential to serve Malachi Thorne directly. The rejection had been swift, brutal, and entirely legal under the twisted laws of their kind. The physical proximity to the man who had torn their soul thread made her chest burn with biological agony. The mating mark on her collarbone, long scarred over, pulsed with a hot, sickly heat. The rejection had been absolute, a violent tearing of magic and spirit that had left her bleeding on the floor of their shared quarters while he walked away without a backward glance. Now, facing him beneath the shadowed pines, her inner wolf let out a silent, vibrating snarl of warning, yet Seraphina forced her spine to remain entirely straight. She did not reach up to soothe the burning skin. She simply stared at him, her face a mask of frozen porcelain. "Trespassing on the outer perimeter," the arrogant wolf said, his voice a low, mocking rumble that carried over the howling wind. He stepped closer, his heavy leather boots crushing the pristine snow and carrying pack resources beyond the designated grounds. "That is a crime of theft against the royal vaults." It was a blatant, ridiculous lie. She was exactly where the stable master had ordered her to be, hauling the feed that the guards themselves consumed. But truth did not matter in the Valdran territory. Only power mattered. He needed her gone. Her continued existence as a low-status reminder of his past was a stain on his newly acquired noble reputation. She was a ghost he could not afford to let wander the borders of his pristine, ambitious life. "I am completing my assigned labor," she stated quietly. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the gelid air with absolute clarity. She did not defend herself further. She knew he had not brought elite guards into the sub-zero night to listen to reason. Her words were merely a formal acknowledgement of her innocence, a truth spoken softly into the void. Torrin Blackwood's eyes flashed with sudden, irrational fury. He hated her silence. He hated that even shivering, soaked in frozen mud, and standing in the shadow of his overwhelming authority, she did not look at him with fear. She looked at him the way one looks at a dying fire. There was no desperate plea for him to remember their past, no hysterical sobbing for forgiveness. Her absolute composure mocked him in ways 1,000 insults never could. "Seize the thief," he ordered, snapping his gloved fingers. The 2 heavy guards moved instantly. They grabbed her arms, their thick, armored gauntlets bruising her fragile biceps. She did not struggle. Fighting would only give them the excuse to break her legs. She stood perfectly still as the commanding officer stepped forward, pulling something heavy and metallic from his belt. The unmistakable, terrifying clank of moon-steel chains. The heavy, silver-infused links were designed to bind rogue alphas and violent criminals. They were forged to suppress the inner wolf, draining the magic and warmth from anyone locked within them. The sight of them being used on a frail, freezing Omega was a grotesque overkill, a testament to his underlying cowardice. The pale metal glinted maliciously in the moonlight. He grabbed her left wrist, his grip bruising and unnecessarily cruel. The metal cuffs snapped shut over her delicate bones with a loud, final click. The mechanism locked. Instantly, a wave of sickening, paralyzing cold shot up her arm. The moonsteel chains burned against her pulse points, eating away at the faint reserves of magical energy, keeping her core warm. The sharp edges of the iron dug into her skin, drawing a thin line of raw, warm blood that dripped onto the white snow. The contrast of the vivid red against the pristine white was stark, a violent punctuation mark to his cruelty. He locked the second cuff over her right wrist. She was now heavily chained, the heavy center link dragging her shoulders forward. The cold was agonizing. The silver burned like dry ice against her skin, sending vicious spikes of pain straight to her heart. It was a biologically oppressive weight meant to force compliance. Torin Blackwood leaned in close, his exhales hot against her frozen cheek. "You should have run when I broke the bond. Now, you will rot in the dark, and no one will ever speak your name again." He waited. He hovered there, desperately waiting for the tears to fall, for her to drop to her knees in the snow and beg him for mercy. He wanted her to ask why he was doing this, to acknowledge the immense power he held over her life. He hungered for the validation of her breaking point. Seraphina slowly lifted her chin. The heavy chains rattled against her chest. She looked directly into his eyes, her storm-silver gaze boring into his soul. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, she thought, feeling the ancient, dormant magic of her true bloodline stirring deep beneath the suppressing silver. The starlight crest, hidden beneath the marred skin of her collarbone, seemed to thrum with a slow awakening heartbeat, but she kept her mouth firmly shut. She offered him nothing, no tears, no fear, just the terrifying promise of her silence. Frustrated by her flawless dignity, Torin stepped back, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "Drag her to the citadel," he spat to the guards, turning his back on her to march toward the safety of the keep. The guards yanked the heavy chains, forcing her to stumble forward into the deep snow. The biting wind howled through the trees as they marched her away from the border. In the distance, the massive, imposing structure of the obsidian citadel loomed against the night sky, its black stone towers piercing the clouds like jagged teeth. It was a fortress of despair, a monument to the harsh rule of the Pack's elite. The march to the obsidian citadel was a masterclass in silent suffering. The heavy snow deepened with every mile, pulling at Seraphina's freezing boots. The moonsteel chains clanked rhythmically, a brutal metronome marking her descent into absolute captivity. The silver-infused metal had already eaten through the top layer of her skin at her wrists. The raw, blistering burn contrasting sharply with the numbing cold of the winter air. Torin rode a massive black destrier a few paces ahead, his dark wolf fur cloak snapping in the violent wind. He did not look back. He did not need to. The broken mate bond radiating from his chest was a suffocating pressure, a constant, crushing reminder of his betrayal. Yet, he masked his internal agony with outward cruelty, determined to prove to the entire pack that his decision to abandon his fated mate had been justified. The citadel rose from the jagged cliffs like a monument to cruelty. It was built of black, volcanic stone, completely devoid of the warmth that usually characterized a pack's home. There were no hearths visible from the outer courtyard, no golden light spilling from the heavy iron-barred windows, only the cold, pale glow of the moon reflecting off the icy battlements. The massive iron gates groaned open, the sound echoing like a dying beast across the silent tundra. They dragged her through the central courtyard. A few late-night guards stopped their patrols to watch the spectacle. They expected a feral rogue, a snarling, desperate criminal caught stealing from the royal vaults. Instead, they saw a half-frozen Omega in a soaked, muddy tunic, heavily bound in the pack's most restrictive chains. The sheer absurdity of the overkill made a few of the older wolves shift uncomfortably, their instincts recognizing the unnatural cruelty of the scene, but no one spoke. In the Valdron pack, silence was the currency of survival. Torin halted his horse near the entrance to the lower keep. He gestured sharply to the guards, put her in the deep cells, the ones below the waterline. The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second. The deep cells were meant for monsters, for wolves that had lost their minds to the bloodlust. Not for a frail, freezing stray. But Torin Blackwood, freshly elevated in the Royal Guard's ranks, was not a man to be questioned. They grabbed the center link of her chains and yanked her toward the heavy, iron-reinforced door leading to the dungeons. The descent was a plunge into absolute sensory deprivation. The torches on the stone walls grew sparser the deeper they went, the air turning thick, damp, and overwhelmingly foul. The scent of old blood, rotting straw, and suffocating despair clung to the slick, moss-covered steps. Seraphina's chest hitched as the temperature plummeted even further. The subterranean chill of the deep cells was different from the winter wind. It was stagnant. It was a cold that crept into the lungs and refused to leave. They shoved her into a small, windowless cell at the very end of the corridor. The heavy iron door slammed shut, the metallic boom reverberating through her aching skull. The lock engaged with a heavy final thud. Then the retreating footsteps of the guards faded away, leaving her in absolute crushing darkness. The dungeons were where you went to be forgotten. Seraphina collapsed onto the freezing, wet stone floor. Her knees hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her spine. She curled her body inward, trying to preserve whatever minuscule amount of body heat remained in her freezing core. The moon-steel chains dragged across the floor, heavy and punishing. The silver burned. It burned with a relentless, agonizing heat that made her wrists throb with every slow, deliberate beat of her heart. She closed her eyes. The physical pain was immense, overwhelming in its sheer intensity. The gelid water from the stable had dried into sharp, icy needles against her skin. The raw, bleeding cuts on her wrists pulsed with the sickening poison of the silver. The severed mate bond in her chest ached like an open, festering wound. Every lungful of air was a battle against the crushing weight of her reality. The darkness pressed in from all sides, heavy and suffocating, thick with the forgotten suffering of 1,000 condemned souls who had perished in these very cells. Seraphina was not like them. She was not a victim waiting for the executioner's blade. She drew a slow, shaky gulp of air, filling her lungs with the damp, rotting air of the dungeon. She focused on the slow rise and fall of her chest. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. She focused on the ancient, dormant heartbeat of her inner wolf. It was completely silent, suppressed by the heavy chains and the absolute exhaustion of her body. But it was there. It was waiting. She raised her right hand, the heavy chains scraping against the stone. With numb, trembling fingers, she traced the jagged, raised scars on her left collarbone. The scars that Torin believed were the ugly remnants of her low-status birth. The scars he had mocked when he tore their bond away, declaring her unworthy of standing by his side in the High Council chamber. He didn't know. He didn't know that beneath the raised tissue, hidden from the eyes of the cruel, power-hungry pack, lay the Starlight Crest, the ancient, legendary silver-blue sigil of the true heir of the Valdron pack. He didn't know that the blood running through her veins was older and more powerful than the obsidian walls of his precious citadel, and that the lunar flame he so highly revered would bow to her very presence. They thought they had buried her. They thought the cold would finally break her spirit. They thought the heavy, silver-infused chains would suppress whatever pathetic scrap of magic she possessed. They believed they could erase her from the history of the realm, discarding her in the darkest pit they could find. Yet, as Seraphina lay shivering on the dungeon floor, the starlight crest beneath her scars pulsed with a faint, impossibly warm silver light. It was a warmth that no biting chill could extinguish, a warmth that no moonsteel could suppress. It thrummed with the ancient power of the moon goddess, a quiet promise of reckoning that vibrated through the freezing stones of her cell. Tomorrow, they would drag her before the High Council. Tomorrow, Torin Blackwood would stand beneath the sacred lunar flame and accuse her of crimes she did not commit. He would try to strip away the last remaining shreds of her dignity before Elder Ronald Gale and Malachi Thorne. He would expect her to beg. Let him try. She lowered her hand, her silver eyes snapping open in the absolute darkness. The freezing cell no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a chrysalis, and tomorrow the entire Valdron pack would learn that some bloodlines were never meant to kneel. Time in the deep cells did not pass, it accumulated. It settled over the freezing, wet flagstones like a heavy silt, burying whoever was locked in the absolute dark under layers of sensory deprivation and creeping frost. The dark suffocated. Seraphina remained curled on the floor, her breathing shallow and deliberately paced. The subterranean cold was a living entity here. It gnawed at the frayed edges of her threadbare tunic, sinking its teeth into the raw, bruised flesh of her shoulders. But the ambient temperature was nothing compared to the violent, localized agony of the moon-steel chains. The heavy, silver-infused metal cuffs locked around her wrists were designed to suppress the biological magic of violent rogues. On an exhausted, half-frozen Omega, the effect was devastating. The silver burned like dry ice against her pulse points. It leached the vital warmth from her bloodstream, replacing it with a slow, paralyzing numbness that crept steadily up her forearms. The sharp edges of the iron had long since bitten through her fragile skin. Thin ribbons of raw blood had frozen into dark, jagged lines against the pale metal. Every time she drew a breath, the heavy center link dragged against the stone, the metallic scrape echoing endlessly in the suffocating black. It was a calculated cruelty, meant to break the mind long before it broke the body. She did not weep. She did not waste precious caloric energy on panic. Seraphina was very good at being unseen, at surviving in the spaces where the world forgot to look. For years, she had scrubbed the outer courtyards and hauled water through the freezing mud, enduring the casual cruelty of the high-born wolves without a single complaint. She focused entirely on the faint, impossible warmth radiating from the hidden scars on her collarbone. The starlight crest, an ancient secret buried deep beneath her skin, pulsed with a slow, dormant rhythm. It was a quiet anchor in an ocean of ice, a reminder of the royal bloodline that ran purely through her veins. A sudden disruption in the ambient air pressure signaled the opening of the heavy iron door at the top of the stairwell. The heavy, rhythmic thud of leather boots descending the stone steps shattered the silence. A flickering orange glow bled through the rusted iron grate of her cell, casting long, monstrous shadows against the weeping walls. The sharp, acrid scent of burning pitch from a wooden torch cut through the stagnant smell of damp earth and old blood. Beneath the smoke, a second scent invaded the space: expensive leather, pine, and suffocating arrogance, the scent of a broken soul thread. Torin Blackwood halted on the other side of the iron bars. He stood bathed in the torchlight, wrapped in a thick, luxurious cloak of dark wolf fur that protected him from the biting subterranean chill. His broad shoulders completely blocked the narrow corridor. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply stared through the rusted iron at the shivering, chained woman on the floor. He wanted to see her broken. He needed to see her crawling toward the bars, weeping, begging for a scrap of mercy or a warm blanket. He needed the validation of her utter defeat to quiet the frantic, biological panic of his own inner wolf, which clawed at his ribs in absolute horror at what he had done to their fated mate. The physical proximity to the Alpha who had severed their sacred bond was a brutal shock to her system. The scarred tissue on her collarbone flared with a sudden, hot agony. It was the visceral, burning pain of a torn soul thread, a phantom limb being twisted in a vice. Her breath hitched, a tiny, involuntary sound in the freezing air, but she instantly locked her jaw. She forced her spine into a rigid, unyielding line. She did not look up. She kept her storm-silver eyes fixed on a crack in the stone floor. "Look at what you forced me to do," Torin finally spoke. His voice was a low, mocking rumble that vibrated against the iron bars. "You could have quietly faded away in the kitchens. You could have accepted your place in the mud. But you had to wander the borders. You had to remind the elders that you still exist. It was a lie, all of it. She had been ordered to the perimeter by the stable master, a detail Torin had undoubtedly arranged to fabricate his charges. He had ensured she was isolated, tearing her away from the one soul who had ever offered her kindness, Gemma Sterling. Gemma, the low-status maid who had secretly pressed hot bread into Seraphina's freezing hands on winter mornings, had wept openly when the royal guards dragged Seraphina away in chains. But truth was irrelevant in the face of Torin's ruthless ambition. He held the torch higher, the orange flames casting erratic, dancing light across the sharp angles of his face. He was beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, sharp and entirely hollow. "Tomorrow morning the High Council convenes," he continued, his tone dripping with practiced political condescension. "I will present the ledger to the Sovereign. I will show them exactly how a bitter, discarded Omega attempted to steal from the royal vaults out of spite. The elders will sign your banishment decree before the sun reaches its peak. You will be stripped of your pack citizenship and thrown into the Deadlands. A feral stray, left to freeze." He paused, leaning closer to the iron grate. His knuckles were white where he gripped the cold bars. "Beg me," he whispered, the sudden, desperate crack in his voice betraying his arrogant posture. "Ask me for mercy, Seraphina. Plead for your life, and I might convince the priest to let you serve the rest of your miserable days, scrubbing the dungeon floors instead of dying in the snow." Seraphina slowly lifted her head. The heavy chains rattled against her chest, a stark metallic punctuation to the absolute silence she offered him. The torchlight caught her face, revealing skin pale as porcelain and lips tinted blue from the cold. But her eyes were terrifying. They were completely devoid of the hysteria or the pathetic surrender he so desperately craved. She looked at him with a vast, freezing emptiness. She looked at him as if he were already a ghost. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken. She observed the micro-expressions of his panic. Despite the freezing temperature of the deep cells, a single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. His chest rose and fell just a fraction too fast. Power built on lies was brittle, and Torin Blackwood was fracturing under the weight of her unflinching gaze. He could sever the bond, but he could not sever her dignity. The cold iron of the cell seemed to absorb his frantic energy, returning only a suffocating stillness. He shifted his stance, the heavy leather boots scraping loudly against the uneven stone. Desperate to fill the void she left wide open. She did not give him the satisfaction of a single word. She simply let him drown in his own manufactured narrative, watching as the phantom weight of his guilt pressed down on his broad shoulders. He was an alpha who had thrown away a true mate for a scrap of political favor, and the profound, instinctual wrongness of that choice was tearing his wolf apart from the inside out. "Nothing to say," he sneered, though his voice lacked its previous venom. He struck the iron bars with his heavy gauntlet, the loud clang masking the sudden tremor in his hand. "Fine, rot in the dark. By noon tomorrow, no one will ever speak your name again." He turned sharply, his heavy fur cloak swirling in the narrow corridor. He marched back up the stone stairs, taking the warmth of the torchlight with him. The heavy iron door at the top slammed shut with a deafening boom. Absolute blackness swallowed the cell once more. Seraphina lowered her head, the icy stones pressing against her bruised cheek. The silver burned, the cold bit into her bones, but deep beneath the surface, the ancient, dormant heartbeat of her lineage pulsed a little stronger. Let him build his throne of lies. Let him gather the entire pack to bear witness. A name unspoken for 1,000 years was about to grow teeth. Hours bled into an indeterminate grey haze. The transition from night to morning was unmarked by sunlight in the subterranean abyss. Instead, it was signalled only by a subtle shift in the draft, carrying the faint, distant scent of fresh pine wood smoke from the upper keep's hearths and the sudden, violent turning of the heavy iron lock. The door groaned on its ancient hinges. 2 armed guards from the inner keep stepped into the cell, carrying thick leather restraints and a heavy iron key. They did not speak to her. They moved with the cold, mechanical efficiency of executioners. One guard unlocked the heavy center ring that bound her to the floor, violently hauling her upward by the chain between her wrists. Her legs, stiff and partially frozen from the damp stone, gave way. She stumbled forward, her knees hitting the hard ground, but the guard simply dragged her upward. The moonsteel cuffs dug brutally into her raw skin, tearing open the half-frozen wounds. Warm, fresh blood trickled down her numb fingers, dripping onto the pristine grey stones of the stairwell. The ascent was a grueling physical torment. Every step required monumental effort, her lungs burning as they transitioned from the stagnant, freezing air of the dungeons to the slightly warmer, oxygen-rich corridors of the upper keep. The contrast in temperature felt like needles pricking violently across every inch of her skin. The scent of ozone and polished wood replaced the reek of damp earth, but the sensory shift offered no comfort. It only marked her progression toward the slaughter. They hauled her through a series of winding, torch-lit hallways. The oppressive, dark stone of the lower levels gave way to gleaming stone floors and towering vaulted ceilings. The architecture of the obsidian citadel was designed to intimidate, built to humble anyone who dared to stand before the absolute authority of the realm. Massive tapestries depicting ancient bloody victories hung between the high, stained glass windows, their heavy woven threads capturing the morning sunlight. The air in the corridors grew warmer, saturated with the overwhelming scent of hundreds of high-status wolves gathering for the spectacle of her execution. Every passing lord and lady cast a look of absolute disdain toward her chained form, their sharp noses crinkling at the smell of her blood and damp captivity. Finally, they reached the colossal oak doors of the High Council chamber. The heavy wood swung inward with a deep, resonant groan. The blinding light of the morning sun pierced through the massive eastern windows, hitting Seraphina's eyes with the force of a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, her vision swimming with spots of color, but she forced her spine straight. She would not let them drag her across the threshold. She planted her battered boots on the gleaming stone and walked forward on her own power, the heavy silver chains clanking with every deliberate step. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. The High Council chamber was immense, a grand circular amphitheater of power. Hundreds of high-status wolves filled the tiered stone benches that ringed the room. They wore silk, velvet, and heavy furs, their expressions a collective mask of aristocratic disgust and cold curiosity. The air in the chamber was stiflingly warm, thick with the scent of melting beeswax, expensive pine incense, and the sharp, metallic tang of burning ozone. In the center of the room, sunken slightly below the viewing tiers, was the trial pit. The guards shoved her forward into the center of the polished stone floor. They stepped back, leaving her entirely isolated under the crushing weight of 100 hostile stares. At the far end of the chamber, standing beside a massive ornately carved brazier, was Elder Ronald Gale. The strict, traditionalist priest wore flowing robes of pure white linen, stark against the dark stone of the citadel. He held a heavy ceremonial staff in one hand and an ancient, leather-bound ledger in the other. Beside him in the heavy iron brazier burned the sacred lunar flame. It was a column of pure, cold blue fire. It produced no heat, yet it illuminated the faces of the council with a sharp, unforgiving clarity. The flame was a physical manifestation of the moon goddess's judgment, a holy relic used to verify bloodlines and absolute truths. As Seraphina stood yards away from the brazier, the starlight crest hidden beneath her scarred collarbone reacted biologically to the blue light. A sudden, rushing warmth flooded her chest, a hum of ancient, resonant magic that fought against the suppressing poison of the moonsteel chains. But her attention was immediately drawn upward. High above the trial pit, seated on a massive balcony, carved from a single slab of black volcanic rock, was the Sovereign. Malachi Thorne did not sit like a man. He occupied space like a terrifying dormant storm. The absolute ruler of the royal pack was a towering, lethal presence. He wore a simple, tailored tunic of dark grey, completely devoid of the ostentatious furs and jewels worn by the lesser nobility. A heavy iron crown rested upon his dark hair. His storm-grey eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply exhausted. He carried the absolute mandate of the realm, a ruler who had spent decades holding together a fracturing kingdom while bracing for ancient prophecies that promised ruin. He leaned forward slightly, resting his heavy jaw on a scarred, battle-hardened fist. He looked bored, profoundly irritated by the domestic squabbles of his lower guards, yet, as his piercing gaze locked onto the chained Omega in the center of the pit, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He noticed the chains. He saw the grotesque, unnecessary overkill of the moonsteel cutting into her fragile wrists, and he noticed her posture. She was dressed in rags, soaked in frozen mud, and bleeding onto his pristine marble floors. But she did not cower. She did not weep. She stood perfectly still in the center of the hostile amphitheater, her chin lifted, radiating a quiet, absolute dignity that defied the miserable reality of her physical state. She did not look like a guilty thief. She looked exactly like something carved from the bedrock of the earth itself, unyielding and unbreakable. The absolute ruler of the sovereign pack felt a strange, inexplicable pull deep within his own chest, a sudden sharpening of his senses that cut through decades of numb exhaustion. His inner beast, usually a slumbering, dangerous force that only responded to imminent threats, suddenly paced against his ribs. It was highly alert, completely fixated on the bleeding woman in the trial pit. A sharp, authoritative strike of a wooden gavel shattered the murmurs of the crowd. Elder Ronald Gale stepped forward, his stern face devoid of any compassion. The High Council of Valdron is now in session. By the grace of the lunar flame and the absolute authority of Malachi Thorne, we shall hear the charges against the accused. From the front row of the noble tiers, Torrin Blackwood stepped down into the pit. He was dressed in immaculate formal regalia, a tunic of midnight blue silk, heavy silver pauldrons resting on his broad shoulders, and a polished sword hanging from his hip. He looked every inch the rising noble, the pristine, loyal servant of the crown. He walked toward the center of the floor with a smooth, predatory grace, his chest puffed out with arrogant confidence. He did not look at Seraphina. He stopped a few paces away, turning his back to her, and addressing the high balcony directly. He bowed deeply toward the brooding gaze of the sovereign. "My sovereign, honored elders of the High Council," Torrin began, his voice projecting loudly, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. "I stand before you to expose a dangerous threat to the security of our inner keep, a threat born of bitterness and petty spite." Torrin turned sharply, dramatically extending a gloved hand toward the chained woman. "The accused, Seraphina, is a low-status stray without a pack name, a woman I once foolishly took pity upon, believing she could be rehabilitated. When I recognized her unstable, volatile nature and legally severed our bond to protect my duties to the crown, she did not accept her place, her mind fractured with jealousy." The crowd murmured, the high-born wolves whispering to each other behind velvet fans and gloved hands. They eagerly devoured the melodrama, utterly blind to the truth of what stood before them. Last night, under the cover of the winter storm, she abandoned her assigned labor in the stables. Torrin lied smoothly, pacing the smooth stone expanse. She bypassed the outer perimeter guards and infiltrated the royal storage vaults. She was caught red-handed, attempting to steal winter rations and, more egregiously, sacred silver relics belonging to the High Temple. He reached into his heavy wool cloak and produced a small silver chalice and a forged ledger sheet. He handed them respectfully to Elder Ronald Gale. The priest inspected the items, his face tightening with traditionalist outrage. "The evidence is undeniable," Torrin declared, his voice rising to a self-righteous crescendo. "She sought to undermine the pack's survival during the harshest winter we have faced in a decade. A crime of this magnitude, committed by a wolfless stray with no loyalties, cannot be met with simple imprisonment. It demands absolute excision." Seraphina remained perfectly still. The heavy chains pulled at her shoulders, the raw iron biting deeper into her bone with every passing minute. The severed mate bond in her chest burned with a sickly hot ache as Torrin weaponized their past, twisting the agony of his betrayal into a weapon against her character. Yet she did not interrupt him. She did not scream that it was a lie. She listened to the rhythm of the room, feeling the cold, blue light of the lunar flame washing over her bruised skin, waiting for the precise moment the trap would spring shut. Torrin stopped pacing. He turned to face her, his eyes shining with triumphant malice. He believed he had won. He believed the heavy stone walls of the citadel would simply crush her out of existence. "I petition this High Council," Torrin said, his voice dropping into a solemn, grave register designed to sound heroic. For the safety of our realm, the accused must be permanently stripped of all remaining pack rights. She must be branded a traitor, driven past the eastern borders into the Deadlands, and exiled forever. The word forever echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the Obsidian Citadel, bouncing against the ancient stained glass windows and settling like a heavy layer of ash over the trial pit. The grand amphitheatre instantly erupted into a low, vicious hum of aristocratic approval. The high-born wolves of the royal pack leaned forward in their tiered stone seats, their velvet cloaks rustling like a flock of carrion birds descending upon a fresh carcass. They nodded to one another, their sharp, beautiful faces twisted into identical masks of self-righteous disgust. To them, the conclusion was already written in the cold stone of the floor. The outcast had dared to overstep her invisible boundaries, and now the fragile illusion of her existence was being permanently erased. She was nothing to them, a ghost in mud-soaked clothes, a footnote in their grand ancient history. The trial was supposed to break her. Everyone in the cavernous room expected the sudden, violent collapse of a shattered spirit. They waited for the chained woman to throw herself onto the gleaming floor, to weep openly and beg Torin Blackwood for a fraction of the mercy he had just violently stripped away. They hungered for the pathetic, desperate sobs of a discarded Omega, realizing the absolute finality of the Deadlands. They wanted her ruined, but Seraphina Vane did not cry. No tears, not today. She did not sink to her knees. She did not tremble. Even as the moonsteel chains aggressively leached the vital heat from her bloodstream, turning the raw skin around her wrists a sickly shade of violet, she kept her spine entirely straight. The physical agony was immense. The silver-infused metal felt like biting acid against her pulse points, while the broken bond in her chest throbbed with the sickening, hot rhythm of a festering wound. The sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. Yet she stood perfectly still. She looked at the man who had betrayed her with a vast, freezing emptiness that made the surrounding air feel instantly heavier. She was a woman anchored in a deep, subterranean silence, refusing to offer a single drop of her sorrow to the monsters gathered to drink it. At the far end of the chamber, Elder Ronald Gale turned away from the accused with a sweep of his pure white linen robes. The strict traditionalist had heard enough. The forged ledger and chalice were absolute proof in his rigid, uncompromising worldview. He stepped toward a heavy black iron lectern, positioned just outside the harsh, cold perimeter of the lunar flame. Lying upon the slanted iron surface was the council scroll. It was a massive, ancient length of thick vellum used to record the absolute decrees of the sovereign court, its edges darkened by centuries of accumulated judgments. The high priest reached out with a skeletal, age-spotted hand and unrolled the heavy parchment. The dry, crackling sound of the vellum stretching open was incredibly loud in the sudden, expectant quiet of the chamber. He picked up a long ceremonial quill, dipping the sharp tip into a vial of thick crimson ink that smelled sharply of crushed iron and dried blood. "The evidence is recognized," the priest declared, his voice a dry, echoing rasp that carried absolute legal weight. He did not bother to look at the bleeding woman in the center of the pit. By the authority of the ancient laws, the accused is found guilty of treasonous theft and perimeter violation. I shall now scribe the decree of permanent exile, stripping her of all pack protections, name, and right to the sacred hearth. The sharp, scratching sound of the quill against the heavy parchment began. It was the sound of a life being legally extinguished. Torin stood a few paces away, his chest rising and falling with a deep, victorious breath. He adjusted the heavy silver pauldrons on his broad shoulders, his dark wolf fur cloak settling perfectly around his imposing frame. He had done it. He had excised the only remaining physical evidence of his low-status past, securing his unblemished path toward the inner circle of the royal guard. He allowed a small, cruel smirk to touch the corner of his mouth as he listened to the priest writing her doom. He had won. Or so he thought. Then the silence of the trial pit was shattered. A breath, a shift. "I do not accept this judgment." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried an impossible, resonant acoustic weight that brought the scratching of the ceremonial quill to a violent halt. The voice did not tremble. It was melodic, terrifyingly calm, and completely devoid of the hysterical panic expected from a condemned prisoner. The entire amphitheater froze. Hundreds of hostile, glowing eyes snapped downward, instantly locking on to the frail, mud-soaked figure standing in the center of the polished floor. Stillness. Absolute stillness. Seraphina had not moved, but the shift in her atmospheric presence was absolute. She was looking directly past her former husband, ignoring his sudden, furious flinch entirely. Her storm-silver gaze bypassed the arrogant nobility in the tiered seats and bypassed the rigid traditionalist at the lectern. She looked entirely upward, fixing her unblinking stare directly onto the high volcanic rock balcony where the sovereign sat in absolute shadow. "The accused will remain silent," Torin barked, his voice cracking with a sudden, irrational spike of panic. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a deep, instinctual horror. His inner wolf violently slammed against his ribs. A sudden, feral reaction to the sheer, unyielding authority radiating from the woman he had discarded. He took a heavy step toward her, his gloved hand dropping instinctively to the polished hilt of his sword. "You have no voice in this chamber, Stray. The judgment is sealed." "The judgment is forged," she replied, her voice remaining at that exact, chillingly level volume. She did not even look at him. She kept her eyes locked on the towering presence above. And under the Third Age covenant of the lunar reign, a pack member facing the absolute penalty of permanent exile cannot be condemned solely by the ink of a lesser noble. "I claim the ancient rite of the altar. I claim the ritual of the flame." A collective gasp of sheer, unadulterated outrage ripped through the upper tiers. The highborn wolves stood up, gripping the stone railings, their fangs bearing in sudden, vicious offense. The audacity was breathtaking. The ritual she invoked was a sacred, ancient bloodline inspection, a holy rite reserved exclusively for the founding families to prove their absolute purity and truth before the lunar flame. For a nameless, wolfless Omega from the stables to demand the touch of the sacred elements was considered the highest form of blasphemy. Elder Ronald Gale dropped the ceremonial quill. The heavy feather clattered against the iron lectern, leaving a thick smear of crimson ink across the vellum. His face twisted into a mask of pure religious fury. Blasphemy. The priest hissed, his hands trembling as he gripped the edges of the lectern. "You dare invoke the sacred rites, a broken thing with no lineage. The holy fire would burn the very flesh from your bones for such arrogance. You have no right to the altar. Make her kneel," a lord shouted from the upper tiers, his voice echoing violently across the chamber. "Break her legs for speaking to the crown." Torin drew his blade an inch from its scabbard, the sharp hiss of steel cutting through the screaming demands of the crowd. He was sweating now. The heavy scent of pine and his suffocating arrogance was suddenly laced with the sour, metallic odor of genuine fear. He needed her silenced immediately. He needed the heavy iron doors of the deep cells to close over her head before the terrifying, quiet confidence in her eyes could manifest into something he could not control. "My sovereign, permit me to silence this insolence," Torin pleaded, looking frantically up at the high balcony. "She is stalling. Her mind is fractured. Allowing a stray to touch the sacred elements will taint the holy sanctum of our ancestors." The screaming demands of the nobility reached a deafening crescendo, a wave of violent sound crashing down into the trial pit. But above it all, seated upon his throne of black glass and iron, Malachi Thorne remained perfectly still. A king in shadow, the absolute ruler of the royal pack watched the woman in chains with a sudden razor-sharp intensity. His storm-grey eyes, previously clouded with the deep exhaustion of a king who had spent decades holding a fracturing kingdom together, were now entirely clear. He saw the violent reaction of his court. He saw the desperate, sweaty panic radiating from the ambitious guard in the center of the floor. And then he looked at the Omega, raw blood, cold iron. She was bleeding onto his pristine floor. The moonsteel chains were visibly eating into the fragile bones of her wrists, the poison spreading in dark, bruised veins up her forearms. Yet she stood like a monolith, Her chin was lifted, exposing the delicate, scarred column of her throat to the hostile room. Her breathing was slow, measured, and completely unafraid. Malachi's inner beast, a terrifying, slumbering war-wolf that had survived countless battles, suddenly rose to its feet within his mind. It did not snarl. It did not prepare to strike. It simply paced against the cage of his ribs, profoundly agitated, recognizing a hidden, ancient resonance in the quiet woman that his human eyes could not yet categorize. There was a heavy, terrifying presence buried beneath her bruised skin, a silence that demanded absolute attention, a sovereign truth. The king slowly uncurled his massive fist. He raised a single, scarred hand. The gesture was minimal, requiring almost zero physical effort, but the effect was instantaneous. The deafening roar of the amphitheater was severed, as if a physical blade had cut the vocal cords of every noble in the room. The silence crashed back down, absolute and suffocating. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to move. The absolute mandate of the sovereign was a physical pressure that crushed the air from their lungs. Malachi leaned forward, the heavy iron crown resting upon his dark hair, catching the ambient light of the morning sun. The ancient laws do not discriminate by the cleanliness of a petitioner's tunic, elder, the king spoke. His voice was a deep, rumbling baritone that vibrated through the very bedrock of the citadel. It was beautiful the way a blade was beautiful, sharp, cold, and effortlessly lethal. The law states that any wolf facing the Deadlands may seek the truth of the flame. If she is a liar, the elements will reduce her to ash on my floor, and your ledger will be unnecessary. Torin's face drained of all color. He took a rigid step backward, the polished sword sliding uselessly back into its scabbard with a dull click. Sire, she is a stray. The taint of her blood. I did not ask for your counsel, guard. Malachi interrupted, the ambient temperature of the room seemingly dropping 10 degrees at the quiet, lethal edge in his tone. The sovereign's slate-colored gaze shifted to Torin, pinning the ambitious man in place with absolute, terrifying authority. Step back, or I will have you chained to the very floor she stands upon. Torin swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly in the absolute silence. He bowed stiffly, his hands shaking as he backed away toward the perimeter of the pit, unable to hide the frantic, feral terror bleeding into his scent. Malachi turned his heavy gaze back to the priest. Prepare the rite. Let the accused stand before the altar. Elder Ronald Gale's face was a pale mask of constrained fury, but he dared not defy the direct command of his sovereign. He bowed deeply toward the balcony, his white robe sweeping across the stone before turning his hostile, burning glare upon the chained woman. The priest abandoned the council scroll on the iron lectern, the crimson ink left to dry unfinished. The atmosphere in the trial pit shifted from political hostility to heavy, suffocating religious dread. The rite of the flame was not a simple interrogation. It was a biological and spiritual excavation, an ancient magic designed to physically burn away deception, exposing the absolute, unvarnished truth of a soul's lineage and intent. For a low-status wolf, the pure elemental power was known to be agonizing, sometimes lethal. The crowd watched with bated breath, their cruel anticipation pivoting seamlessly from the joy of a banishment to the promise of a gruesome public execution by holy fire. The high priest moved toward the massive, ornately carved brazier that dominated the far end of the chamber. The sacred lunar flame burned within the heavy iron bowl, a towering column of pure cold blue fire. It did not consume wood or coal. It burned purely on the ambient magic of the Pack's territory, a physical manifestation of the ancient law's watchful eye. The light it cast was spectral, creating deep, shifting shadows that danced aggressively against the polished marble floor. Positioned on a small obsidian pedestal beside the brazier was a covered vessel forged from solid silver. Elder Gale lifted the heavy lid with extreme reverence, exposing the sacred lunar water contained within. The liquid was completely transparent, yet it seemed to catch and magnify the azure glow of the fire, glowing with an internal, volatile luminescence. It smelled sharply of ozone, crushed winter mint, and the heavy, metallic tang of an impending thunderstorm. The priest retrieved a shallow, beautifully engraved silver basin. With slow, ceremonial precision, he tilted the heavy flagon, allowing the sacred liquid to cascade into the bowl. The water flowed with the thick viscosity of liquid glass. As it hit the silver basin, it refracted the violent blue light of the brazier into 1,000 sharp, cerulean splinters that painted the dark stone walls of the amphitheatre. The sound of the pouring liquid was impossibly loud, cutting through the tense silence like the chiming of ancient bells. Seraphina watched the preparation without a single tremor. No fear, just waiting. The heavy moonsteel chains dragged her shoulders downward, the cuffs cutting new, jagged lines into her bleeding wrists, but she ignored the pain entirely. She focused on the physical sensation of the blue light washing over her face. It felt cold against her cheeks, yet deep within her chest, beneath the raw, raised tissue of her collarbone. The hidden starlight crest was responding with immense biological violence. The ancient royal sigil embedded in her skin was waking up. It recognized the holy elements. It remembered the sacred water and the cold fire. For decades, the magic of her true lineage had lain dormant, forced into deep hibernation by the necessity of survival in a pack that would have slaughtered her for her blood. But now, standing directly in the focused aura of the altar, the crest thrummed with a heavy golden heat that pushed aggressively against the icy suppression of the silver chains. It was a slow, resonant heartbeat of pure power, rising up from the marrow of her bones to meet the judgment of the court. Elder Gale turned away from the brazier, holding the heavy silver basin in both hands. The cold blue light of the liquid illuminated his stern, deeply lined face from below, casting him in the terrifying visage of an ancient executioner. He began the slow, rhythmic procession toward the center of the pit, one step, then another. The soft, scraping sound of his white linen robes dragging across the marble floor marked the countdown to her absolute exposure. Every step he took amplified the heavy scent of ozone in the air. The high-born wolves in the galleries leaned over the stone railings, their breaths held, their eyes wide with morbid fascination. Torin stood rigidly by the outer pillars, his fists clenched so tightly his leather gloves audibly creaked, completely unaware that the doom he had orchestrated for her was about to fall squarely upon his own head. And high above, seated in the shadows of the volcanic balcony, Malachi Thorne remained absolutely motionless. His massive hands gripped the armrests of his throne, his storm-grey eyes tracking every micro-movement of the Omega's posture. He was waiting to see the terror in her eyes. He was waiting for the moment her stoic facade cracked under the terrifying proximity of the divine elements. But Seraphina did not crack, not a flinch, not a breath. As the priest closed the distance, stopping barely 3 feet away from her chained form, the ambient temperature in the immediate vicinity plummeted. The sacred lunar water in the basin radiated a chilling, magical frost that crystallized the edges of the silver bowl. Elder Gale looked down at her with absolute, unwavering contempt. He believed he was standing before a dirty, treacherous stray about to be burned alive by her own lies. "The holy elements do not tolerate deception," the priest intoned, his voice echoing loudly for the entire court to witness. "The water shall wash away the illusions of the flesh, and the flame shall reveal the absolute truth of the blood. If you carry the taint of theft, if you carry the hollow soul of a traitor, this water will boil the skin from your frame." Seraphina did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze in false humility. She looked directly into the hostile ancient eyes of the high priest, her storm-silver gaze suddenly reflecting the violent blue light of the brazier. "Then let it wash," she said, her voice dropping into a register of such profound ancient calm that Elder Gale involuntarily tightened his grip on the silver basin and let the entire court bear witness to what remains. The heavy silence in the amphitheatre reached a breaking point. The air grew impossibly thin. The scent of burning pine from the upper hearths seemed to vanish, replaced by the crushing, electric pressure of the impending ritual. The priest slowly raised his right hand, his fingers dipping into the freezing, luminous liquid of the sacred lunar water. The drops clung to his skin like liquid diamonds, glowing with the terrifying power of the lunar flame's judgment. He lifted his hand, preparing to cast the holy water across her bruised and scarred collarbone, standing directly on the threshold of a revelation that would shatter the foundations of the realm. The drops of the sacred lunar water hung in the air for a fraction of a heartbeat. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to a microscopic crawl within the grand amphitheatre of the Sovereign's court. Elder Ronald Gale flicked his wrist, and the freezing, luminous liquid left his wrinkled fingertips. It arsed through the charged air, catching the intense azure flare of the lunar flame, like scattered diamonds cast against the dark, imposing stonework. Seraphina Vane did not blink. She did not retreat from the holy element that the entire court believed would boil her flesh to the bone and expose her as a fraud. She simply stood her ground, her spine perfectly straight, the heavy moonsteel chains dragging against her raw wrists, and she waited for the impact in absolute silence. The sacred lunar water struck her exposed skin. The physical reaction was instantaneous, but it was not the agonizing hiss of boiling treason the high-born wolves had hungered for. There was no smoke. There was no screaming. Instead, the moment the freezing liquid made contact with the raised, marred tissue of her collarbone, a blinding flash of pure cerulean light erupted from her flesh. It was as if a dormant star had been violently cracked open in the center of the trial pit. The ambient temperature in the chamber, previously stifling, with the body heat of hundreds of spectators, and the burning pine incense, plummeted into a profound, breathless absolute zero. The scent of ozone and ancient magic instantly consumed the room, completely obliterating the cheap lavender soap of the kitchens and the heavy musk of the terrified nobles. Spidery patterns of heavy, glittering frost began to creep along the polished marble floor, originating entirely from where she stood. Seraphina slowly reached up with her heavy, shackled hands. The moonsteel chains clanked loudly against her chest, a brutal, metallic sound that was suddenly swallowed by the rising, resonant hum of the magic awakening deep within her veins. Her fingers, stained with her own raw blood from the dungeon walls, gripped the frayed edge of her threadbare woolen tunic. She pulled the collar back. The scars were gone. The ugly, jagged tissue that her former mate had once mocked as a symbol of her low-status birth had completely melted away under the touch of the sacred element. In its place, embedded directly into the porcelain pallor of her skin, was the starlight crest. It was a massive, intricate sigil of a roaring wolf, intertwined with Celestial's phases of the moon, glowing with a terrifying silver-blue brilliance. It did not merely rest on her skin. It burned with a living, breathing internal fire that pulsed in perfect synchronicity with her heartbeat. The intricate lines of the crest seemed to shift and flow, alive with the suppressed energy of 1,000 forgotten generations. The light it cast was not the cold, judgmental glare of the brazier. It was the heavy, ancient glow of the true air of Valda, a magic so pure and unadulterated that the lunar flame behind the priest suddenly flared, bowing its massive column of fire toward her in a physical manifestation of absolute reverence. Elder Ronald Gale stood frozen, his arm still suspended in the empty air from casting the water. The high priest's eyes widened to an impossible degree, the whites showing entirely around his pale, weathered irises, his rigid, traditionalist worldview, built upon decades of absolute hierarchy and careful political calculation, shattered in a single, catastrophic instant. The breath left his lungs in a ragged, audible wheeze. He stared at the glowing royal sigil, his mind completely failing to process the magnitude of his own catastrophic error. The ceremonial staff slipped from his trembling fingers. The heavy wooden rod, crowned with solid silver and used to pass judgment upon thousands, hit the polished marble floor with a deafening clatter. It rolled uselessly away, stopping near the bloody drag marks of her chains. The priest's knees gave out. His flowing white linen robes collapsed around him like a deflating sail as he fell heavily to the stone. He did not merely kneel in formal respect. He collapsed in pure, visceral terror. His skeletal hands hit the marble, his forehead pressing so hard against the cold floor that the brutal impact echoed in the silent room. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to reading the council's scroll, worshipping the myth of the first blood, the founding royal family that was supposed to have perished centuries ago in the Dark Wars. And now, he had just prepared that very scroll to scribe a decree of permanent exile for its sole surviving heir. "Goddess have mercy," the priest choked out. His voice was a broken, wet sob that carried no authority, only the pathetic desperation of a man realizing he was already a ghost. The true blood, the first blood, the silence in the amphitheater was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that pressed down on the lungs of every high-born wolf in the tiered seats. The mocking whispers, the cruel anticipation of an execution, the aristocratic disgust, all of it was instantly vaporized by the blinding light radiating from her collarbone. They were entirely paralyzed. The hierarchy they worshipped had just been violently inverted, and they were trapped in the epicenter of the resulting shockwave, unable to draw breath. By the outer pillars, Torin Blackwood stopped breathing, the arrogant, ambitious guard who had orchestrated this entire tribunal felt his nervous system completely hijack his brain. He stared at the silver-blue sigil burning on her skin, his pupils dilating until his storm-grey eyes were almost entirely black, the starlight crest, the mark of the supreme rulers, the myth that mothers whispered to their pups to explain why the Valdron pack held its territory against the dark. He had seen the scars on her collarbone 1,000 times during their brief, broken marriage. He had touched them. He had mocked them. He had used them as absolute proof of her genetic inferiority. When he severed their sacred mate bond to climb the ranks, he didn't know. He hadn't known that the woman he had forced to scrub the freezing mud of the outer perimeter was the blood of the gods. He hadn't known that the quiet, unyielding spine he had tried to break with moonsteel was forged from a bloodline older than the obsidian walls surrounding them. All he had known was his own petty, blinding ambition. He had thought Gemma Sterling was a fool for sneaking the discarded Omega Extra bread in the freezing stables. He had thought he was untouchable. The forged ledger and chalice he had planted in her quarters suddenly felt like the most damning evidence of his own impending execution. A wave of sickening, paralyzing dread washed over Torin, turning the marrow in his bones to ice. The heavy silver pauldrons on his broad shoulders suddenly felt like crushing anvils. The dark wolf fur cloak he wore, to symbolize his high status, felt like a burial shroud. He had chained his sovereign. He had dragged the true heir of the realm through the deep snow, locked her in the rotting dark of the deep cells, and demanded she be thrown into the Deadlands. The magnitude of his treason was absolute. Seraphina ignored the weeping priest at her feet. She dismissed the hundreds of terrified nobles trembling in the galleries above her. She turned her head, the silver-infused chains rattling sharply, and kept her storm-silver eyes fixed entirely on the architect of her suffering. The glow of the starlight crest intensified, reacting to her shift in focus. It was not just a symbol of political authority, it was a biological mandate. The magic of her ancient blood was intricately tied to the very earth of the Pack's territory, a supreme power that governed the instinct of every wolf standing within the Citadel's walls. And right now, that immense, terrifying power was entirely focused on the man who had betrayed her. The fallen guard tried to take a step backward. He tried to retreat into the shadows of the outer pillars, desperate to escape the blinding accusatory light radiating from her skin. But his body refused to obey. His inner wolf, a creature built entirely on the rigid laws of dominance and submission, recognized the supreme aura of the starlight crest. The beast within him slammed violently against his ribs, not in defiance, but in absolute groveling panic. The instinctual override was brutal. His knees buckled. He fought it. He gritted his teeth, his jaw locking in a desperate attempt to maintain his upright posture. The muscles in his thighs screamed, trembling violently as he tried to force his human will against the overwhelming biological imperative of his inner beast. He reached for the hilt of his polished sword, a pathetic, reflexive gesture of a cornered coward, but his fingers were entirely numb. The scent of pine and his suffocating arrogance was completely replaced by the sour, sharp stench of feral terror. The glowing silver-blue aura expanded from Seraphina's collarbone, a visible shockwave of ancient authority that washed across the polished marble floor. It hit him with the force of a physical blow. His inner wolf completely surrendered. The ambitious soldier crashed to the floor. The heavy silver pauldron slammed into the stone with a loud metallic crack that echoed violently through the silent amphitheater. He did not just kneel, he was flattened. His hand splayed out uselessly on the marble, his forehead hitting the floor so hard it split the skin above his brow. A thin line of raw, warm blood trickled down the bridge of his nose, pooling on the pristine stone. He was pinned. The invisible, crushing weight of her ancient blood pressed down on his spine, forcing him into a posture of absolute, whimpering submission. He could not breathe. The pressure on his chest was monumental. Every time he tried to draw a breath, the severed mate bond in his chest, the very connection he had brutally torn apart to secure his future, burned with a searing, agonizing heat. It was the physical manifestation of his profound mistake, a biological punishment for rejecting the one soul he was supposed to protect. He let out a low, pathetic whine. The sound was completely involuntary, a feral noise of a beaten animal begging for mercy. We are small things in a world of teeth, and the teeth had just been bared. High above the trial pit, seated on the volcanic rock balcony, Malachi Thorne felt the invisible shockwave hit the upper tiers. The immediate physical reaction was violent and uncontrollable. Malachi's massive chest seized. The air was violently driven from his lungs, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying pressure that bowed his spine. The apex predator within his soul, the terrifying, battle-scarred beast that had conquered the Valdron Pack territory through pure, unadulterated bloodshed and had never once bowed to any living creature, suddenly slammed against his ribs. It did not roar in defiance. It let out a raw, desperate howl that demanded absolute, instant submission to the ancient blood standing below. The cold, subterranean dread that had defined his exhausted reign cracked under the impossible, resonant warmth radiating from the Omega. His heavy iron crown suddenly felt like a crude, worthless forgery in the presence of the authority of the ancient sigil. Malachi gripped the obsidian railing, his knuckles turning stark white as his nervous system violently recalibrated to the sheer magnitude of what he was witnessing. He swallowed the metallic taste of his own shock. Malachi Thorne did not waste a single second lingering on the crowd's horror. The immediate, suffocating tension in the room demanded a response from the sovereign, and he moved with a deliberate, lethal grace, turning sharply toward the sweeping stone staircase. Every heavy footfall of the monarch's boots on the stone stairs sent a fresh tremor of panic through the amphitheater. The high-born wolves held their breath, watching the lethal, storm-grey predator descend. They did not know what was about to happen. They did not know if the sovereign would perceive her ancient blood as a threat to his reign, or if he would yield to the supreme authority of the royal sigil. The tension was a physical wire pulled entirely taut, humming with the promise of imminent violence. But Seraphina did not flinch. She watched the massive ruler approach, her posture unwavering. The silver-infused metal continued to bite into her wrists, the poison creeping steadily up her arms, but the internal heat of her awakened magic held the encroaching cold at bay. She had spent years mastering the art of enduring agony in silence. She remembered the freezing nights in the stables, the rare moments of quiet human warmth when Gemma Sterling had snuck her extra rations of dry bread, shielding her from the worst of the pack's cruelty. She had survived all of it without shedding a single tear. She could wait a few moments longer for him. Malachi reached the bottom of the stairs. He stepped onto the polished stone of the pit, striding purposefully forward. He paid no attention to the grovelling form of Torin Blackwood, who had orchestrated this disaster. He bypassed the weeping high priest without a single glance. He moved with a terrifying, single-minded focus, his storm-grey eyes locked entirely on the bruised, frail woman standing before the lunar flame. He stopped 2 feet away from her. The sheer difference in their physical size was staggering. He was a towering mountain of battle-hardened muscle, draped in dark grey and cold iron. She was a frail, shivering figure in mud-soaked rags bleeding onto the floor, Yet as they stood face to face, the energetic hierarchy was completely inverted. She did not look small. She looked like the very center of gravity, pulling the entire room into her undeniable orbit, Storm Grey colliding with Storm Silver. The impact was visceral. It was a silent conversation between two apex forces, a bridging of the immense chasm between the present ruler and the ancient blood. Malachi felt the connection in the marrow of his bones. He felt the impossible, resonant warmth of her aura cutting through the stagnant, freezing isolation of his own cursed existence. He saw the raw, bruised skin on her wrists, the dark veins poisoned by the silver chains, and a sudden, violent surge of protective fury erupted in his chest. The woman who had survived the freezing mud without a single tear. The woman who had accepted the brutal severance of her mate bond with flawless dignity. The woman who had marched into the High Council chamber in chains and shattered the entire pack hierarchy simply by speaking the truth. Discarded by the weak, yet exalted by ancient blood, Seraphina took a single, deliberate step forward. The heavy center link of the moonsteel chains dragged across the polished marble with a harsh scraping sound. It was the only noise in the room, a brutal reminder of the physical torment she was still enduring. The glow of the starlight crest pulsed with every beat of her heart, casting long, shifting shadows behind her. She stopped inches from his massive chest. "The elements have spoken," Seraphina said. Her voice was quiet, melodic, and completely devoid of the hysterical triumph that a lesser wolf might have displayed. It was the voice of a ruler stating an undeniable, absolute fact. The forged ledger and chalice are proven false. The accusation is broken, and yet I am stilled in chains. Her words hung in the charged air, a quiet challenge that carried the weight of 1,000 ancient laws. She was not asking for her freedom. She was demanding that the court rectify its monumental failure. She was forcing the reigning authority to publicly dismantle the cruelty that his own guards had inflicted upon her. Her former mate let out another strangled whine from the floor behind her. Torin's face was pressed so hard against the marble that he could barely draw breath, but his mind was racing with frantic, disjointed thoughts. He had tried to bury her. He had tried to erase her from the history of the pack, to secure his own worthless status. And instead, he had provided her with the grandest stage in the realm to claim her absolute supremacy. He was going to die. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, sending fresh waves of paralyzing terror through his trembling muscles. The elders would execute him. His own inner wolf was already tearing him apart for his treason against the true blood. Malachi looked down at the moonsteel chains. He saw the raw, torn flesh of her wrists. He saw the dark, bruised lines where the silver had leached the warmth from her blood. And for the first time in his long, brutal reign, the absolute ruler felt a profound, agonizing surge of shame. This had happened under his watch, his guards, his laws, his monumental failure. He slowly reached out with his massive, scarred hands. A collective gasp echoed from the upper tiers, quickly muffled by velvet cloaks. No one touched moonsteel without heavily insulated gauntlets. The silver was designed to violently burn any wolf that made direct contact with it. But Malachi did not wear gloves. He reached out with his bare hands, his large fingers, gently encircling the heavy, silver-infused center link that bound her wrists together. The moment his skin touched the metal, a loud, violent hiss echoed in the quiet chamber. The silver burned him instantly, searing the flesh of his palms, but his storm-grey eyes did not waver. He did not flinch. He gripped the thick chain with a terrifying, lethal strength. "No true sovereign wears iron in my halls," Malachi stated, his voice a low, rough rumble that vibrated heavily against her collarbone. He pulled. The muscles in his massive arms corded with explosive, terrifying tension. The veins in his neck stood out in stark relief as he forced his immense physical power against the magically reinforced metal. The moonsteel groaned, letting out a high-pitched, metallic squeal that set the teeth of every noble in the room on edge. The silver burned deeper into his hands, the sharp sense of searing flesh filling the air, but the monarch did not stop. He channels the raw, primal fury of his inner beast, pouring decades of restrained power into a single, devastating motion. With a deafening crack that sounded like a thunderclap, the heavy center link shattered. The thick metal fragments exploded outward, clattering violently across the trial pit floor. The sudden release of tension caused the heavy cuffs on Serafina's wrists to fall away. Hitting the stone with a dull, heavy thud, she was free. The immediate relief was visceral. The burning, paralyzing cold of the silver instantly receded, replaced by the rushing, golden warmth of her awakened magic, surging back into her freezing extremities. She drew a deep, shuddering breath, her lungs expanding fully for the first time since she had been thrown into the stables. The starlight crest on her collarbone flared even brighter, illuminating the massive, scarred chest of the towering protector standing before her. Malachi slowly lowered his burned, bleeding hands. He did not inspect his wounds. He looked directly at her, the fierce, terrifying predator of the Valdron pack, the man who had buried entire armies and held the realm together with an iron fist, suddenly shifted his stance. He stepped back, creating a deliberate, respectful space between them. And then, he did something that caused the entire amphitheater to collectively stop breathing. Malachi Thorne dropped to one knee. He went down heavily on the polished marble floor, his dark grey tunic folding around him. He bowed his head, exposing the vulnerable nape of his neck to the Omega in mud-soaked rags. It was an act of complete, absolute submission. The reigning sovereign was publicly yielding his authority to the true heir of Valda. A name unspoken for 5 years grows teeth, my king, she thought, watching the mighty ruler lower his gaze. The starlight crest has returned, Malachi said, his voice echoing with a profound, solemn reverence that silenced the final, lingering doubts of the court. The iron crown bows to the first blood. Command us, my queen. The realm is yours. The silence that followed was total. It was the sound of a world order being completely rewritten. The arrogant guard, still pinned to the floor in his feral terror, let out a final broken sob of absolute despair. The high priest remained curled in a fetal position, weeping into his white robes, and the hundreds of high-born wolves who had mocked her, who had sneered at her, who had demanded her execution, they all stood frozen in absolute, paralyzing dread. Serafina Vane stood above the kneeling sovereign, the silver-blue glow of the starlight crest illuminating the vast, dark architecture of the obsidian citadel. She looked at her raw, bleeding wrists, and then at the terrified monsters who had tried to bury her in the dark. She did not need to scream. She did not need to weep. Her absolute, unbreakable silence had already broken them all. Now it was time to rebuild. The complete surrender of the Iron Crown sent a physical shockwave through the upper tiers of the grand amphitheater. The crushing silence that followed the king's kneeling form was not merely the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that pressed down on the lungs of every highborn wolf in the chamber. The rigid ancient hierarchy of the Valdron pack, a structure built upon centuries of ruthless dominance and calculated political cruelty, had just been violently inverted in the span of a single heartbeat. The terrifying predator who had held the realm together with an iron fist was currently bowing his head to a woman wearing mud-soaked rags. And the ambient magic of the territory, the very bedrock of their existence, was singing in harmonious, golden agreement. The collective paralysis of the nobility finally broke, shattering into a chaotic, desperate panic. The elders of the High Council, the very wolves who had sneered at her from their velvet-draped seats and demanded her legs be broken, suddenly scrambled out of their tiered benches. They did not walk. They cascaded down the sweeping stone steps in a frantic, undignified wave of rustling silk and heavy winter furs. Their aristocratic pride completely evaporated under the terrifying, supreme aura radiating from the starlight crest. They hit the smooth floor of the trial pit and immediately threw themselves to their knees, their expensive garments soaking in the spidery puddles of melting frost left behind by the sacred lunar water. Elder Ronald Gale was already on the floor, but the sheer terror of his monumental failure drove him into a frenzy of frantic motion. The strict traditionalist scrambled on his hands and knees across the wet stone, his skeletal fingers slipping wildly as he crawled toward the heavy iron lectern. He reached up, grasping the edges of the ancient vellum council scroll, where the ink of her banishment decree was still wet. With a guttural, weeping sob, the priest violently tore the heavy parchment in half. The dry, crackling sound of the tearing vellum echoed sharply across the room. Thick, wet crimson ink smeared across his pure white linen robes, staining his chest like a mortal wound. But he did not care. He ripped the forgery again and again, desperately trying to unwrite the catastrophic sin he had almost committed against the First Blood. "The charges are rescinded," the high priest wailed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, reedy pitch that carried none of its former religious authority. He cast the shredded, ink-stained parchment into the cold blue fire of the brazier, watching it turn instantly to ash. "Burn the ledger! The forged ledger and chalice is a falsehood. We were blind. My queen, forgive our blindness. Do not withdraw the blessing of the roots from our lands. I beg you, do not leave us to the dark." All around him, the ancient lords and high-status ladies of the court joined in the frantic chorus of begging. They pressed their foreheads to the freezing marble, weeping openly, their hands outstretched in pathetic supplication. They were not begging for forgiveness out of sudden moral clarity. They were begging out of pure, biological terror. Their inner wolves recognized that the woman standing in the center of the pit held the energetic anchor of the entire kingdom in her fragile, scarred hands. If she willed it, the protective magic of the Valdron territory would wither and die, leaving them exposed to the lethal winter and the feral rogues beyond the borders. They were entirely at her mercy. Seraphina Vane did not offer them a smile. She did not offer them a single word of absolution. She stood amidst the weeping sea of high-born monsters, her storm-silver eyes scanning their groveling forms with a vast, freezing emptiness. She remembered how these same faces had looked at her with pure disgust barely an hour ago. She remembered the decades of invisible labor, the freezing nights in the stables, the stale bread and the casual, everyday cruelty they inflicted upon the low-status workers of the keep. She remembered Gemma Sterling, the only neighbor who had ever shown her basic human warmth, offering her a bruised apple when the kitchen master locked her out in the snow. She remembered the sheer exhaustion of trying to survive in a kingdom that viewed her as a disease. We are small things in a world of teeth. But the teeth had finally been bared, and the monsters were choking on their own venom. She slowly lowered her gaze to the massive dark-haired sovereign, kneeling just a few feet away. Malachi Thorne had not moved, while his entire court descended into hysterical weeping and frantic apologies. The supreme ruler remained perfectly still, a silent monolith of dark grey tunic and battle-hardened muscle. He kept his head bowed, his broad shoulders rising and falling with slow, measured breaths. He did not beg. He simply offered his complete submission, waiting for her command. Seraphina looked at his hands. The heavy, silver-infused metal of the moonsteel chains had seared the flesh of his palms, leaving deep, blistering burns across his calloused skin. The sharp scent of scorched iron and raw blood drifted upward, a visceral testament to the violent strength he had exerted to shatter her restraints bare-handed. He had willingly absorbed the poison meant for her. It was a micro-gesture of unyielding protection, a physical sacrifice that cut through the lingering numbness of her exhaustion. "Rise," she commanded. Her voice was quiet, but it projected with effortless, melodic clarity over the whimpering of the court. Malachi obeyed instantly. The towering monarch stood, his massive frame casting a long, heavy shadow across the marble. Although standing at his full height, a lethal weapon of war who dwarfed her completely, he maintained a posture of profound deference. His piercing grey eyes met hers, and for a fraction of a second, the heavy, subterranean dread that had always clouded his gaze was gone. In its place was a sharp, fiercely alert clarity. The instinctual pacing of his inner beast had ceased entirely, replaced by the profound, settling warmth of a predator that had finally found its true north. He did not reach out to touch her. He knew his raw, bleeding hands were unfit and he possessed a terrifying patience that demanded he respect the physical boundaries of the woman who had just survived a nightmare. Instead, the king took a half-step backward and turned his broad shoulders toward the sweeping stone staircase that led up to the high volcanic rock balcony. He extended his uninjured forearm toward the ascent, offering himself not as a master, but as a vanguard. He was formally escorting her out of the trial pit, elevating her above the groveling masses. Seraphina took the first step. The heavy fragments of the broken chains still hung from the leather cuffs around her wrists, clinking softly against the fabric of her mud-soaked tunic. As she moved, the sound was a rhythmic, metallic chime that cut through the weeping of the elders. As she walked past the massive, ornately carved brazier, the sacred lunar flame reacted to her proximity. The towering column of cold blue fire physically bowed, the flames leaning heavily toward her path, casting a brilliant, dancing luminescence across her pale skin. The ambient temperature in the room continued to shift, the biting chill of the morning fully giving way to a heavy, resonant golden warmth that seemed to radiate directly from the glowing starlight crest on her collarbone. They ascended the dark stone steps in tandem. The king matched his long, powerful strides to her slower, exhausted pace, placing his massive body between her and the lower tiers in a silent, unwavering guard. The climb was slow. The marble steps were steep, carved for the long legs of ancestral warriors, but the king did not rush her. He served as her shield against the hundreds of staring, terrified eyes below. His broad back blocked the drafts of cold air whistling through the high windows, creating a pocket of warmth that eased the shivering in her exhausted muscles. The scent of him, a rich, intoxicating blend of ozone, crushed pine and burning gold, enveloped her, grounding her frayed nerves. She focused on that scent. It was the only real thing in a chamber filled with liars and ghosts. The physical journey upward was a literal manifestation of her ascension. Every step she took away from the trial's pit felt like shedding a layer of the invisible, suffocating weight she had carried for 5 long winters. Her bruised knees ached, and her raw wrists stung where the silver poison was slowly being burned away by her awakened magic, but she kept her spine flawlessly straight. They reached the summit of the high balcony. Dominating the platform was the ancestral stone throne. It was a massive, imposing seat carved from a single, unbroken slab of black obsidian and cold iron. It was a relic from the Third Age, a seat of supreme power that had stood empty for generations, as no modern ruler possessed the pure bloodline required to occupy it without suffering the crushing weight of the pack's ancient magic. Although Malachi had always governed from a lesser seat beside it, respecting the dormant laws of the realm, he now stood aside, clearing the path to the true seat of dominion. Seraphina stepped up to the dais. She reached out with her trembling, raw fingers and placed her hand against the polished black glass of the armrest. The ancient stone was not cold. The moment her skin made contact, a deep, resonant pulse vibrated through the solid rock, a biological click of recognition that echoed into the very marrow of her bones. The throne had been waiting in the dark, just as she had. She turned, her storm-silver eyes sweeping over the vast, silent amphitheater below, and slowly sat down. The moment her body weight settled into the obsidian seat, a massive, acoustic boom resonated through the deep architecture of the citadel. It sounded like the heartbeat of a sleeping mountain finally waking up. The heavy, protective wards of the Valdron territory, long faded and brittle, suddenly flared with renewed, invincible strength. The high-born wolves in the pit gasped, collectively, physically feeling the suffocating pressure of the pack's magic anchoring itself permanently to the frail, quiet woman on the balcony. The energetic shift was undeniable. The kingdom was no longer a fractured, exhausted realm bracing for ruin. It was whole. Seraphina sank slightly into the hard stone back of the throne, allowing herself a single, microscopic exhale of relief. The physical exhaustion beneath her awakened magic was immense, a crushing tide of fatigue that threatened to pull her under, but the solid iron of the armrests grounded her. She looked down at the frayed edges of her sleeves, at the dried mud on her boots, and then at the brilliant, silver-blue glow illuminating her chest. Not used, not owned, chosen. The scars of her invisible labor were still there, but they were no longer marks of shame. They were the foundation of her endurance. Beside her, Malachi Thorne took his place at the right hand of the throne. He stood like a terrifying, dark sentinel, his jaw set in a hard line, his storm-grey eyes sweeping the lower levels with lethal intent. He was entirely subdued by her presence, his dangerous instincts voluntarily leashed, yet he was ready to unleash pure violence upon anyone who dared to question her right to sit there. The sheer proximity to his massive, radiating body heat offered a sensory comfort she had not felt in years. It was the heavy, safe warmth of a hearth fire after a lifetime, stranded in a blizzard, but the trial was not yet concluded. There was one final piece of rot that needed to be excised from the roots of her new kingdom. Seraphina's gaze descended to the center of the trial pit floor. Torin Blackwood was still pinned to the ground. The ambitious guard, who had worn his authority like a weapon and his cruelty like a badge of honor, was completely broken. The crushing, instinctual weight of her royal aura had not lifted from his spine. His dark wolf fur cloak was ruined, tangled around his trembling legs, stained with the freezing water and his own blood. The heavy silver pauldrons that marked his high status were cracked against the stone. He was weeping, a low, pathetic, feral sound that echoed miserably in the quiet chamber. He managed to turn his head slightly, his bruised face pressing against the cold marble. He looked up at the high balcony, his dilated, terrified eyes locking onto the woman sitting upon the ancestral throne. He saw the starlight crest blazing upon her skin. He saw the terrifying, unyielding sovereign of the realm standing as her personal guard. The catastrophic scale of his mistake finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He had severed the sacred soul thread with a god. Seraphina did not lean forward. She did not raise her voice. She sat perfectly still in the obsidian throne, her hands resting lightly on the cold iron, and spoke his name. Torin Blackwood. The words carried the heavy acoustic weight of a physical blow. The broken man on the floor flinched violently, his chest heaving as he tried to draw a breath through his panic. "You brought me into this chamber in chains," she stated, her melodic voice washing over the silent, terrified court. "You presented the forged ledger and chalice to the elders, weaponizing the ancient laws to secure your own ambition. You mocked the scars of my labor, and you petitioned this council to strip me of my citizenship, demanding that I be driven past the eastern borders to rot in the Deadlands." Every word was a nail driven into the coffin of his existence. The elders kneeling nearby shrank away from him, desperately trying to distance their own bodies from the epicenter of her impending wrath. Torin opened his mouth, a desperate, bubbly gasp for air escaping his bloody lips, but he could not form a single word of defense. There was no defense. The holy elements had already laid his treason bare. "The law of the lunar reign is absolute," Seraphina continued, her storm-silver eyes devoid of any lingering attachment or sorrow. The phantom ache in her chest, the burning, shattered soul link that had tormented her in the dark, was completely gone. Her awakened magic had cauterized it, leaving behind only a vast, freezing indifference. "You demanded the ultimate penalty for a nameless stray. The crown shall grant you exactly what you asked for." Malachi shifted slightly beside her, his burned hands clenching into fists as he prepared to execute her will, but Seraphina did not require a headsman. Her authority was biological. "I strip you of your rank," she decreed, her voice dropping into a register of ancient, resonant power. "I strip you of your pack name. You are no longer a guard of Valdron. You are no longer a citizen of this keep. You are exiled, permanently and without right of appeal, to the freezing dark you intended for me." The sentence was not merely political. It was a physical severing. The moment the decree left her lips, the biological link that tethered Torin's inner wolf to the protective magic of the pack's territory violently snapped. It was a visceral, agonizing extraction. Torin let out a raw, blood-curdling scream, his back arching off the floor as the ambient warmth of the kingdom was violently ripped from his veins. The phantom blade of her judgment cut his soul away from the earth, leaving him completely hollowed out, a truly wolfless stray in a world of ice. 2 heavy guards from the inner keep, men who had previously served under Torin's command, immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the outer pillars. They did not hesitate. Eager to prove their unquestioning loyalty to the new sovereign, they grabbed the screaming, broken man by the shoulders of his ruined tunic. They did not bother with moonsteel chains. He was no longer a threat. He was nothing. As the guards dragged Torin through the center aisle, the other nobles scrambled out of the way, pulling their silk robes back to avoid touching him. It was a pathetic display of pack politics. Barely an hour ago, they had been nodding along to his smug, false testimony, eager to see him rise to power. Now, they treated him like a rotting carcass. Torin reached out with a trembling, bloody hand, his fingers grazing the velvet boot of a nearby elder. The elder violently kicked his hand away, spitting on the floor. Torin sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound that was quickly swallowed by the sheer vastness of the chamber. He was experiencing the very isolation he had tried to condemn her to, the freezing void. They dragged him backward across the slick marble. His heavy boots scraped loudly against the stone, leaving a faint, dark smear of blood and melted frost in his wake. He thrashed weakly, his eyes rolling back in his head as the sheer agony of the broken pack link consumed his nervous system. The heavy oak doors of the High Council chamber groaned open, revealing the blinding, freezing white of the winter storm raging beyond the outer courtyard. The guards hurled him over the threshold, letting him fall heavily into the deep snow. The colossal doors slammed shut with a deafening final boom. The heavy iron lock engaged. Torin Blackwood was erased. The silence that settled over the grand amphitheatre was profound. It was not the tense, hostile quiet of a trial pit, but the respectful, vast stillness of a sanctuary that had finally been cleansed. The high-born wolves remained on their knees, their heads bowed, waiting for the wrath of the awakened magic to fall upon them next. They expected executions. They expected to be chained and thrown into the deep cells to pay for their years of casual cruelty. But Seraphina did not issue another decree. She did not raise her hand to strike them down. She simply sat upon the obsidian throne, watching the dancing blue light of the lunar flame reflect against the polished floors. She had survived the freezing mud, the public humiliation, and the rotting dark of the dungeons. She did not need to bathe her new reign in the blood of cowards to prove her strength. Her flawless, unbreakable survival was proof enough. She turned her head slightly, looking up at the towering predator standing guard beside her. Malachi was already watching her. The deep exhaustion that had defined his reign for decades was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce devotion that softened the harsh, battle-scarred lines of his face. He looked at the heavy, broken fragments of silver still dangling from her leather cuffs, and then he looked into her eyes. There was a silent, solemn promise in his gaze, a vow that no iron, no cold, and no cruel ambition would ever touch her skin again. She reached out. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Her raw, bruised fingers brushed against the thick leather of his vambrace. Malachi froze. The massive sovereign stopped breathing entirely, his pupils dilating until his storm-grey eyes were almost completely black. He looked down at her small hand resting against his arm. Slowly, trembling with the sheer force of his own restraint, he turned his hand over and gently, impossibly gently, intertwined his burned fingers with hers. The touch did not hurt. The invisible curse that had kept him isolated for so long met the starlight magic and simply dissolved, fading into the pure golden warmth of their fated bond. The agonizing chill that had defined his reign evaporated, replaced by a profound and enduring peace. Outside the heavy stone walls of the obsidian citadel, the howling winter winds finally began to break. The eternal frost was thawing, yielding to the sudden, gentle promise of spring. The Valdron pack had its true Luna, a queen who had endured the darkest depths of the realm without breaking, and who would now rule it with unbreakable grace. They were no longer small things in a world of teeth. They were the architects of their own sanctuary. Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight. When Seraphina stood before that altar and refused to beg, she chose her own dignity over a false bond. Do you think Torrin Blackwood deserved the freezing void, or should he have suffered longer in the deep cells? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you felt the warmth of this story, please take 2 seconds to like, subscribe, and keep our hearth fire burning for more tales of survival, betrayal, and quiet triumphs.